Welcome to Running the Table, the podcast where we run through everything on the table in the world of college basketball. With the madness officially here and Purdue's path laid out for them as the number one seed in the Midwest region, I'm going to go through some of the potential teams that stand in the way of Purdue making it to their first Final Four since 1980. But without further ado, let's run it. So, Purdue back as the number one seed again. We've been in this road before. We saw how it ended last year. So, of course, we have to start off talking about the 116 matchup, which as of tonight has been identified as Purdue versus Grambling State, who won an overtime game 88-81 against Montana State. Quite frankly, I'm a little bit happier about seeing Grambling State, even though they look pretty good. But in terms of actual matchup wise, I think Purdue matches up with Grambling State a little bit better than they matched up with Montana State. Looking at Grambling State, some of their strengths are that their defense. They held every conference tournament foe to 66 or less point, two of them being in the 50s. Now this overtime game ended up in the 80s. So I think they were tied 72-72 going into overtime. So not a super low scoring one in that one. Another one for them is their 3-point shooting. They averaged 45% through three conference games from deep in their conference tournament, and they did shoot 4 for 10 for 40% against Montana State in this first four game, as well as a slow pace. That's another thing that they like to do. They want to slow you down. The less possessions, the better for them. They are not a very speedy team by any means. But in terms of weaknesses for Grambling State, they're a little bit reliant on free throws. They don't shoot it very well, but they get to the free throw line a lot. They're not super efficient, though. They don't make as many as they should. They shoot 70.6% as a team. In their first four matchup, they went 18 for 23, so that's far better than they usually do. They shot 78.3%. So if they can shoot more near that percentage, they're going to have a lot better success. But that's not how it's been statistically or on average for them throughout the season. Another weakness for them is actually kind of 3-point shooting. I mentioned them as a potential strength, but it's more been because they've shot well recently. Throughout the year, they actually are only 319th nationally in 3-point scoring, averaging 33.9% as a team. So they're shooting pretty well as of now, but they've shown signs to struggle. So I can't necessarily put that as an outward strength for them. So it's something to watch and see how Purdue was able to defend that. And in general, scoring is not usually fantastic for them. They only average 67.6 points per game. And they're kind of reliant on low scoring games, which might be difficult against Purdue, depending on, how Purdue is shooting in their matchup with them. But obviously, I truly do believe that Purdue will not struggle nearly as much with Grambling State as they did with Fairleigh Dickinson last year. I will stand by the fact that they are a different team this year, and they're just way more well-rounded, which leads us to the second round, which means that Purdue would face the winner of number 8 or the 8 seed Utah State and the 9 seed TCU. In terms of some KenPom rankings for the two, in terms of offensive efficiency, Utah State sits at 39th, while TCU sits at 44th. So they're both pretty good offensive teams. And defense, they're also pretty well matched up, with Utah State at 68th and TCU at 63rd. The big difference in these is adjusted tempo. Utah State wants to be a bit faster at 107th in the country, whereas TCU is 298th. So in terms of some of the strengths for Utah State, they have a balanced scoring attack. They have 4 players who can lead them in scoring on any given game. So you don't really know who it's going to be depending on, who has the hot hand in that game. And they do have strength at key positions. They have a great point guard and power forward, which arguably are two of the most important positions when it comes to consistency in college basketball, especially in the NCAA tournament. We talk about how important guard play is, as well as they push the pace. We talked about borderline top 100 in adjusted tempo. That has been known to bother Purdue in the past at times. Now, when Purdue faced Arizona, they had no problem with the tempo that Arizona wanted to keep, but that can pose Purdue some issues at times. In terms of weaknesses, Utah State is actually 3-point shooting. They shoot 33% as a team, and they don't shoot very many either. So it's not a strength in their game, but they do kind of know it. They don't push the 3-point shot a lot. And great Osabor versus bigger opponents can be an issue for them. He's only 6'8", 250 pounds, so he is dominant, has been dominant throughout the season for them, especially in conference play, but he won't necessarily be as dominant against bigger opponents that they face, which, if they come to face Purdue, could pose, some significant issues if he tries to go one-on-one with that Zach Edey a lot. And kind of on the same vein, rim protection. Because they don't have a ton of size, their big men struggle defensively. And obviously we know how dominant Zach Edey is against kind of whoever he comes up against. If they choose to double team him, we'll see how that works out, if that ends up being the case. But they're not known to have great rim protection. As for TCU, they have a lot of experience. They're the third oldest roster in the country. And they have very active defense. They're at 9.1 steals per game, which, as we know, if you want to affect Purdue, cause some turnovers. And they're not reliant on the three-point shot nearly as much, but they can shoot it pretty well. TCU shoots the three 35.6% as a team, but they barely have 600 plus three-point attempts on the year. So they're not a team that's known to chuck it. But when they do shoot it, they shoot it pretty decently. And for TCU, it's a little bit of inefficient scoring. They are susceptible to long scoring droughts. They're not a super efficient shooting team, and they don't shoot enough threes to make up big deficits. So, for instance, if Purdue was to jump out on a big run against them, will they have the offense and will they have the three-point shooting to essentially get them back in the game and stop Purdue from really opening up a big lead against them? As well as inconsistent post scoring. Against Houston, TCU was 4 for 20 between Miller and O'Bannon, which are two of their forwards. But then they were 11 for 18 and combined for 33 points against Oklahoma the game prior to that. So they have the ability to score well from the post, but it is inconsistent. And depending on the style of defense and depending on whether or not they're shooting well from the inside that game, it's either a great asset for them or it can really be their downfall. And thirdly is turnovers. When TCU speeds up, they can be susceptible to bunches of turnovers, and they average 12.8 turnovers a game. So it's not a very ideal style of play for Purdue. You don't want to turn the ball over a lot against Purdue because Purdue is not particularly known to cause a lot of turnovers. So if you kind of naturally create them a lot yourself, that's not going to be great for matching up with the Boilers. So in terms of who I would prefer Purdue to face, I guess that I think that I would prefer Utah State, but both of these teams are so kind of evenly matched in terms of even their style of play that I don't know. I guess Utah's pushing the pace in terms of tempo might give Purdue some fits, but either way, I don't know exactly who I would actually prefer Purdue playing. So we'll see how that ends up. Then we get to the Sweet 16, where you have the 5 seed Gonzaga and 4 seed Kansas. Both of these games could go chalk, and you see the top seed push their way through. So we're going to look at Gonzaga first. In terms of strength, they have improved their defense as the season has gone on. They struggled in some of the early to mid-season, and largely that's because of their defense. They have a top 10 adjusted offensive ranking, so that's never really been an issue for them. But they have gotten better in defense as of lately. And for them, one of the things that makes their offense so good is their scoring versatility. They have a top 4 that all score 13 plus points per game or right around that range. So they can score in a various number of ways. And they have a lot of veteran experience between that top 4 that scores so well. They have 2 guards and 2 forwards that are all juniors and seniors. The one senior in that group being Anton Watson. In terms of some of their weaknesses, they can be a little sporadic from 3-point range. They only have 24.5% of their scoring production that come on 3-point shots. And that's outside the top 300 nationally. Even though they shoot a pretty good percentage, they shoot 35.4%, it's just not a huge part of their offense. And they're limited consistently in terms of their 3-point shooters. Nolan Hickman and Ben Gregg are the only ones that have shot more than 100 threes on the year that shoot 33% or higher. But Hickman does shoot 40%, so he kind of makes up for some of that consistency, but he's really the only one that shoots it well and shoots it consistently. As well as a weakness for them can be facing formidable interior defensive pressure. So they rely on interior scoring quite a bit, as I mentioned, with kind of the way they shoot the ball from 3 and not doing it a ton. But if they face a team with solid interior defense and rim protection, it can get a little bit tricky. Graham Ike is a solid big, but he's not huge. So he doesn't have a huge size advantage, mostly a strength advantage on a lot of guys he faced. But if he matches up with Edey, and we saw this in Gonzaga's matchup with Purdue early on in the season, he doesn't necessarily have the advantage in that matchup, and they kind of have to see where they can score differently there, even though Gonzaga did stay with Purdue for a lot of that matchup. Then we move on to Kansas. Kansas is a unique team in terms of their strengths, talent and experience. When everyone's healthy, Kansas is a top team between playmaking talent and obviously behind Bill Self as a coach. You've got talent and experience across the board. They do have solid defense, and it's not really the trait that gets talked about much with the Jayhawks, but they are top 75 in adjusted defensive efficiency, and I think that speaks for itself. And another thing for them is sharing the ball. They move the ball very well offensively, take pretty high percentage shots, and that's why they lead the NCAA in assists per game with 18.8. So they can score in a number of different ways, and they really do share the ball to get some of the best shots that they can. But in terms of weaknesses, they're not healthy. I said they're one of the top teams in the country, or can play like a top team when they're healthy, but right now they're not. McCullough is shut down for the NCAA tournament with a knee injury, which they just announced today. And Hunter Dickinson, he's on the mend right now from a dislocated shoulder. Those are the top two scorers for Kansas. So losing an 18-point per game scorer and the other one being iffy, it does not bode well for the Jayhawks. And on another note similar to that, they have a lack of depth. They're not a deep team. Their starting five are the only players to play 20 plus minutes per game. And they only play 7 deep, with 2 others who play 19 and 14 minutes per game apiece outside of their starting 5. So now without KJ McCullough, they're going to have to look towards playing some of their role guys a lot more minutes, which didn't bode well for them in their matchup with Cincinnati, as you saw in the Big 12 tournament. And another weakness for them is offensive rebounding. They're 291st in the country. They just don't hit the glass on offense very much. I think that some of that could be because of their lack of depth. They don't push nearly as hard in a part of the game such as offensive rebounding, because they kind of need to conserve their energy a bit when they play for as many minutes as they do. And additionally, they're turnover heavy. They average 11.6 turnovers per game, and I don't see that getting better with less depth than usual. I talked about, those role guys playing bigger roles than they're used to. I don't necessarily see them stepping up to the challenge and limiting turnovers even more than they already average when everybody is healthy. So throughout these 4 teams, I would say, I guess that I think Purdue matches up the best with Kansas in terms of play style and being able to dominate inside. With Kansas's lack of depth, I would probably prefer Purdue to play Gonzaga. They've played them before. The style of play fits a little bit better. We'll see if that matchup comes to fruition. But if they pass all of those tests, then they end up back in the Elite 8, which I have narrowed down, in my personal opinion, the 11 seed Oregon, 3 seed Creighton, 2 seed Tennessee. Starting with Oregon, their strengths are inside scoring, and Fali Dante, when healthy, is a dominant force inside for the Ducks. He's been playing a lot better as the season has gone on, and he's been healthy, so he's been on a tear down the stretch, even though he's not necessarily huge. Another strength for them is experience combined with talented freshmen. They are an 8-man deep roster with mostly juniors and seniors, except for 2 talented freshmen in Shellstad and Evans Jr., who keep getting better and better as the year has gone on. And another thing that Oregon does well is 3-point shooting. It's not necessarily an eye-opening percentage with 33.6% as a team, but their top 4 volume scorers shoot almost 35% on average. So if those 4 guys are the guys that are taking the majority of their 3-point shots in any given game, they are a pretty solid 3-point shooting team, and I certainly wouldn't overlook that in terms of if they're playing hot, which they have been playing pretty well lately. In terms of their weaknesses, I would say it starts with their defense. They actually rank 70th in adjusted defensive efficiency, but they've gotten worse as the season has gone on. They've actually ranked 270th nationally in effective field goal percentage on the defensive side in the final month of the regular season, as well as inconsistency rather. Their backcourt shot well during the Pac-12 tournament, but up until the Pac-12 tournament, they really struggled mightily down the stretch. And you kind of see that that common pattern. That last month or so heading into the Pac-12 tournament wasn't too kind to the Ducks, but they turned it around in the Pac-12 tournament, so they're playing much better as of lately. Another weakness for them is sharing the ball. They only average 13.8 assists per game, so they can play a little bit too individual at times, and I think some of that comes with how much they go inside with Dante and some of their other methods of scoring. They don't necessarily move the ball all that efficiently. Moving on to the Creighton Blue Jays. They are a common pick to make it into the Elite Eight from their side of the Midwest region. And understandably, their strengths are very strong. One of them being top 5 talent. They may have one of the best starting fives in the country, and they use their talent well. Another one being the defensive strategy. They're very good at running teams off the 3-point line and funneling them into 7'1" Ryan Kalkbrenner inside, who's an elite rim protector, averaging 3 blocks per game. As well as they're a very solid team rebounding team. They average 38 rebounds per game, and they have 3 guys who average almost 6 rebounds per game or more, but some of that is because of how much their starters play. Their stats are a little bit more inflated. But they're also a very good shooting team. They have shooters all over the floor in Baylor Shireman, Trey Alexander, and Stephen Ashworth, as well as they're an elite free throw shooting team. They shoot 78% as a team, which is a lot better than a lot of these teams that we've talked about thus far. And we know how important free throw shooting can be, especially in close games. But some of their weaknesses, which aren't very many, but one of them is shot creation. They don't have many true shot creators. They manage that pretty well with great ball movement and many guys that can shoot from a lot of different spots on the floor. But if they do face a defense that, makes it a little bit difficult for them to get to the places they want to on the floor, they don't have as many guys that can go one-on-one and truly create shots for themselves. And I would say the biggest weakness that people talk about for Creighton is their depth. They run their starters to death. They try to go to their bench the least they can. But the reason that has worked out for them pretty well, actually very well throughout the season, is they're very good at avoiding fouls. But if you can get them into any type of foul trouble, or if you manage to get them tired, now they don't seem to get tired all that much with how many minutes per game these guys play consistently. But I would say the biggest red flag could be if you can get Creighton in foul trouble, the Blue Jays may or may not be in big trouble because they don't have very much in terms of depth. But another intense defensive team and one of the best teams in this region, the 2-seed Tennessee Volunteers. Their strength, as I just mentioned, they are an elite defense. They are one of the best defenses in the country. I believe they are 3rd in the country in adjusted defensive efficiency. And the Vols have defensive stoppers everywhere between Zakai Ziegler and some other guys. The teams really struggle to put up points against them. Another strength for them is star power. Dalton Connect, as a transfer coming into this season, he has really burst onto the scene as a first-team All-American, scoring 21 points per game. And if he is on, good luck stopping him. Around him, though, they have capable scorers in Jonas Adu and Zakai Ziegler that benefit from the attention that he gets. They also are a very solid team rebounding team. They're top 50 in rebounds per game at 38.8. And they may not be very tall, but they do crash the glass on both ends. But they do have some weaknesses. They are prone to streaky play. Sometimes the Vols settle a little bit too much in terms of shot selection. Either they kind of just settle for ill-advised threes or not very high percentage looks, and that can be the cause for some bad stretches for them. And sometimes they struggle with scoring outside the top 3. Outside of Connect, Adu, and Ziegler, the Vols can struggle to find offense as guys like Josiah Jordan-James and Santiago Vescovi have taken a step back in offensive production this year as opposed to the numbers they put up last year. And another thing is they can be overpowered by physical bigs. I did say they're not a very tall team, and that can lead them to struggle defensively against powerful bigs like Zach Edey when they faced Purdue in Maui. That was, I think, one of the biggest reasons why Purdue was able to come out on top in that matchup. But in terms of what teams that I think could make it to the Elite Eight out of this side, I really do think it'll probably come down to either Creighton or Tennessee. In a matchup between those two in the Sweet 16, I do probably give the edge to Creighton because of their essentially ability to score and 3-point shooting. I think Tennessee can kind of be a little too much one-trick pony behind Dalton Connect on the offensive end, and that's why we've seen them struggle on offense in certain matchups and why they got knocked out of the SEC tournament. But we'll see. Obviously, Purdue has to make it to that matchup themselves for this to even be relevant. So it'll be interesting. I really would hope, I would love to see a Purdue Creighton matchup in the Elite Eight because I really want to see Zach Edey versus Ryan Kalkbrenner. But a lot has to happen for that to line up and for that to be the matchup that we see. But that's all I've got for today. So check out our first round predictions to see what we thought about these matchups and get caught up on these teams with all of our conference recaps videos here on the channel. We sleep in May and the fun is just beginning. So stay tuned, like and subscribe for more. But until next time, I'm out.